Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre sleep habits of the Vikings, the Norse seafarers known for raiding monasteries and apparently having very specific ideas about bedtime. Picture this. It's midnight in 9th century Norway, and while you're tossing and turning because your neighbor's dog won't stop barking, a Viking warrior is calmly getting up to sharpen his axe, check on the goats, and maybe have a philosophical chat with his wife about whose turn it is to feed the fire. You know, normal midnight activities that would probably give you a heart attack if you tried them today. The truth is, if you think your sleep schedule is messed up now, you probably wouldn't survive a single night in a Viking longhouse. These weren't people who set alarms for 7 a.m. and complained about being tired. They had a completely different relationship with sleep. One that was equal parts practical survival strategy and cultural ritual that historians are still trying to fully understand. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this content travels across time zones while people are winding down for the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with one of the strangest sleep quirks the Vikings shared with much of medieval Europe: segmented sleep. That's right, the Vikings didn't sleep in one long continuous stretch like most of us do today. Instead, they practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep. Imagine sleeping for 4 hours, waking up in the middle of the night, doing a few chores or contemplating your enemies, and then going back to sleep for another 4 hours. That was normal. You didn't have insomnia, you were just culturally appropriate. The first sleep typically started not long after sundown. Vikings would wind down the evening by sharing stories, eating a final meal, and probably arguing over whose turn it was to guard the goats. Then they'd settle in for a few hours of rest. But around midnight, right when modern people would consider the night ruined by waking up, they'd rise again. What did they do with that time? A lot, actually. Some would tend to the fire or check on livestock. Others would pray, meditate, or sharpen weapons, which really tells you all you need to know about Viking priorities. According to some sagas, this was also considered an ideal time for intimacy, romantic or otherwise. And while the firelight flickered and the wind howled outside, they'd occupy themselves quietly before easing back into second sleep. Segmented sleep wasn't some random Viking oddity. It was widespread across pre-industrial societies, a natural rhythm influenced by the rising and setting of the sun, not digital clocks and caffeine. Historians still argue whether this pattern was purely biological or culturally reinforced, but most agree it was the dominant sleep pattern for centuries. In the age before artificial lighting, people's internal clocks leaned into these two-part nights like it was the original factory setting. But let's be honest, it's easy to romanticize this from a distance. In reality, waking up in a dark longhouse next to 4 other people, 2 chickens, and an axe probably wasn't the serene, introspective break you might imagine. And let's not forget, it was cold. Extremely cold. Getting out of bed at midnight in 9th century Norway was less about circadian rhythm and more about survival anxiety. The archaeological evidence supports this segmented pattern. Excavations of Viking settlements show hearths designed to burn slowly through the night, suggesting people expected to wake up and tend them. Oil lamps and candle holders are positioned strategically around sleeping areas, indicating that midnight activities were planned for, not accidental. Even the layout of longhouses seems designed with this rhythm in mind, with work areas positioned near sleeping spaces for easy access during the night interval. So you've woken up at midnight in a smoky Viking longhouse. It's pitch black except for the dying embers of the fire. Your feet are freezing, your cousin is snoring like a bear choking on a log, and you've got a good hour or two before second sleep kicks in. Now what? Welcome to the midnight interval, that strange waking period between first and second sleep that Vikings filled with an odd mix of chores, rituals, and whatever else they could do quietly enough not to wake the goat. This wasn't just downtime, it was productive time. The darkness provided privacy for activities that daylight hours spent in communal spaces didn't allow. It was a time for reflection, planning, and personal tasks that the demands of survival made difficult during the day. And unlike our modern midnight snack runs to the refrigerator, every midnight activity had to be carefully planned and executed without disturbing the delicate balance of a household trying to survive another brutal Nordic night. First up, eating. With little refrigeration and zero midnight DoorDash, Vikings often kept dried meats, smoked fish, or leftover stew within reach. Midnight snacks weren't indulgent, they were practical. If you'd spent the evening rowing, farming, or dragging half a deer back through the snow, waking up hungry wasn't unusual. So they'd stoke the fire, heat a bowl of something, and gnaw away in the dark like civilized cave people. But food wasn't the only thing on the midnight menu. This quiet time was often used for reflection. Without light pollution, noise, or smartphones, you could sit by the fire and think about life or death, or whether Odin was disappointed in your sword technique. Midnight became a time for private thoughts, prayers, or whispered conversations. Some believed dreams from the first sleep were clearer, like messages from the spirit world. Others may have spent the time worrying about everything they needed to do the next day, which frankly makes Vikings more relatable than we'd like to admit. And then, of course, there's intimacy. Yes, archaeological evidence and medieval writings suggest many couples chose the middle of the night as prime time for romance. It makes sense. You'd had a few hours to rest, you weren't exhausted yet, and let's be honest, the fire was already going. There's even suggestion that some people timed their entire procreative schedules around this interval. That's right. Vikings invented the midnight booty call. Historians still argue whether this timing was purely practical or held deeper cultural significance. Some scholars suggest the darkness provided necessary privacy in crowded longhouses, while others point to Norse mythology where nighttime was considered a powerful mystical period. The sagas describe heroes receiving divine visions during these midnight hours, suggesting the Vikings saw this time as spiritually significant, not just convenient. The practical aspects were undeniable, though. Tending the fire wasn't optional. It was survival. Let the flames die completely, and you might wake up to find your water frozen solid and your family in serious danger. So someone had to get up, add wood, and make sure the embers stayed alive through the night. This wasn't a chore you could skip because you were feeling lazy. Checking on livestock was equally critical. Vikings kept their animals close, often in attached sections of the longhouse or nearby shelters. A cow getting loose in a snowstorm meant losing valuable protein and milk. A goat breaking free could mean it becomes wolf food before morning. So the midnight check wasn't paranoia, it was economics. Lose your animals, and your family's survival prospects dropped dramatically. The social dynamics of these midnight hours were fascinating. Who got to sleep through the night? Who had to stay awake? Generally, the household head or trusted family members took turns with the midnight duties. Children learned early that everyone contributed to the family's survival, including taking their turn at the midnight watch as they grew older. It was a rite of passage. You knew you were becoming an adult when you were trusted with the midnight fire and livestock check. Women often used this time for textile work that daylight hours made difficult. Spinning wool, mending clothes, or working on intricate embroidery that required concentration. The firelight was dim, but it was steady, and the quiet allowed for focused work that the chaos of daily survival made nearly impossible. Archaeological finds of spindle whorls and textile tools near hearths suggest this midnight crafting was common practice. Men might spend the time maintaining weapons and tools, sharpening blades, repairing handles, or crafting new arrows. Again, the privacy and quiet made this detailed work possible. Plus, in a culture where your life depended on your weapon's condition, midnight maintenance wasn't optional. It was survival insurance. The spiritual aspect can't be ignored either. Vikings believed the veil between worlds was thinner at night, making it an ideal time for communication with the gods or ancestors. Some would use the midnight interval for personal prayers, divination, or simply meditation on important decisions. The darkness and silence created an atmosphere conducive to spiritual reflection that the busy daylight hours couldn't provide. Interestingly, this midnight interval wasn't just about productivity, it was about mental health. Modern sleep researchers have found that people who practice segmented sleep often report feeling more rested and mentally clear. The Vikings might have stumbled onto something we're only now rediscovering. That quiet, contemplative time in the middle of the night provided psychological benefits that our modern compressed sleep schedule might be missing. But let's not romanticize it too much. Waking up in a smoky room at midnight, feeling around for dried fish in the dark, and trying to add wood to a fire without burning down the house wasn't exactly a spa experience. It was cold, uncomfortable, and often scary. Strange sounds outside could mean anything from wild animals to hostile raiders, and you had to decide whether that noise was worth investigating or ignoring. If there's one thing the Vikings knew, it's that the world didn't pause while you slept. Villages got raided, livestock got stolen, and enemies had an annoying habit of showing up just before dawn. So when it came to sleep, especially in wartime or while traveling, the Vikings didn't just sprawl out and hope for the best. They organized sleep shifts. Yes, even bedtime had a battle strategy. Especially on long ships or in military camps, someone was always awake. It might have been the shipmaster, a trusted warrior, or the guy who lost at dice. But someone had to stay alert, scanning the horizon for enemy sails, or making sure the boat didn't drift into a fjord. And if you think modern people complain about night shifts, imagine keeping watch in freezing rain with nothing but your beard for insulation. These shifts usually ran in cycles. One group slept while another kept watch, then they'd switch. The result? No one was ever fully rested, but no one got murdered in their sleep either. It was a compromise, Viking style. The rotation system was carefully planned. You couldn't just randomly assign watch duty. Experienced warriors took the most dangerous shifts, while younger or less skilled members got the quieter middle-of-the-night hours. Even back home, some form of night watch was common. In longhouses, those big communal halls where everyone slept together, someone might stay up tending the fire, listening for wolves, or just making sure the animals weren't chewing on someone's boots again. And in larger settlements, guards patrolled perimeters or manned lookout towers. The archaeological record shows evidence of elevated platforms and defensive positions that would have required constant manning. But this wasn't just about safety, it was about culture. Being always ready was a point of pride. A Viking man wasn't supposed to sleep like the dead. He was supposed to sleep like a warrior, lightly, suspiciously, and with one hand on an axe. Deep sleep was for people who didn't expect to be attacked by surprise. Historians still argue whether this constant vigilance was born from genuine necessity or cultural paranoia, but the evidence suggests it was probably both. And while it sounds exhausting, and probably was, this vigilance was part of their identity. To be Viking was to be tough. You slept when you could, you stayed alert when you had to, and if you dozed off during your watch, well, let's just say someone might urinate in your helmet as a lesson. The practical challenges of maintaining watch schedules were enormous. On a long ship with 30 or 40 men, you needed at least 6 people awake at any given time. 2 to steer and navigate, 2 to watch for threats, and 2 to handle any emergencies that arose. That meant everyone got roughly 4 hours of sleep at a stretch, if they were lucky. Bad weather, enemy activity, or navigational challenges could shrink that even further. Shipmasters developed sophisticated rotation systems. The most experienced sailors took the dawn watch when navigation was most critical. The strongest fighters took the sunset shift when attacks were most likely. The middle-of-the-night hours went to whoever was available, often the youngest crew members who could afford to lose some sleep. It was a delicate balance between giving everyone rest and maintaining security. The psychological toll was significant. Sleep deprivation makes people irritable, paranoid, and prone to making mistakes. On a crowded ship where everyone was armed and tensions ran high, this was dangerous. Smart shipmasters built rest periods into their schedules, understanding that exhausted warriors were useless warriors. But the fundamental truth remained. Someone always had to be awake. Women weren't excluded from this system. In households, wives and daughters often took midnight shifts alongside the men. They might not be scanning for enemy raiders, but they were listening for sick animals, checking on children, or watching for signs of fire. The responsibility for family survival was shared, and sleep was a luxury that had to be carefully managed. The equipment for night watch was specialized. Oil lamps designed to burn steadily through the night, positioned to provide maximum visibility without creating too much light that might attract unwanted attention. Horns for raising alarms kept within easy reach. Weapons placed strategically around sleeping areas so guards could arm themselves quickly if needed. Even the layout of sleeping arrangements reflected security concerns. Important people slept in the center, where they were most protected, while guards positioned themselves near entrances and vulnerable spots. Communication during night watch was crucial but challenging. Hand signals worked in moonlight, but cloudy nights required whispered conversations or predetermined codes. A cough might signal all clear, while a specific whistle pattern could mean danger approaching. These systems had to be simple enough to remember when you were half asleep, but complex enough to convey important information. The social dynamics of watch duty were complex. Taking your turn was a matter of honor, but the quality of your watch duty affected everyone's safety. Fall asleep on guard duty, and you weren't just risking your own life, you were risking everyone's. The pressure was immense, and the consequences of failure were severe. Some sagas describe warriors being exiled or executed for sleeping during watch, though historians debate whether these tales reflect actual practice or literary exaggeration. Picture this. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. There's frost on the windows, a smoky fire in the center, and half a dozen Norsemen curled up under rough woolen blankets. Now look closer. None of them are undressed for sleep. There are no wardrobe changes, no rituals of winding down with cozy robes, because Vikings slept fully clothed, often in the same garments they wore all day. And in some cases, they even added a little something extra, like armor. Let's start with the basics. Viking clothing was all about layering: wool tunics, linen undershirts, thick cloaks, and fur when available. These weren't just outfits, they were survival tools. If you stripped down for bed, you were basically asking to wake up with hypothermia. This was Scandinavia, after all, not a cozy Roman villa with floor heating. The multiple layers trapped body heat and provided insulation that could mean the difference between life and death during brutal winter nights. And while sleeping in your clothes isn't exactly strange by pre-modern standards, the Vikings took it a step further. If you were a warrior, especially while traveling or during times of conflict, you might sleep with a bit of your gear on. Not full chainmail, unless you were extremely hardcore or just had a terrible sense of comfort, but enough to be ready. Because let's face it, the odds of waking up to a raid were non-zero, and fumbling with your pants while someone's breaking down your door with a spear is a quick way to end up in Valhalla. There are sagas that describe warriors dozing with their helmets nearby, weapons at the ready, cloaks still clasped. It wasn't about style, it was about not dying. Comfort was negotiable, readiness wasn't. Archaeological evidence supports this too. Graves of Viking warriors often contain clothing items that show wear patterns consistent with being slept in regularly. The fabric around joints and pressure points shows the kind of repeated stress that comes from lying down in the same clothes night after night. And this wasn't limited to warriors. Even regular folks might sleep in their outer garments during winter months. The idea of putting on warm clothes after waking up simply didn't apply when warmth needed to be trapped and preserved through the night. Taking your shirt off was basically admitting you'd given up. Historians still argue whether this practice was purely practical or reflected deeper cultural attitudes about vulnerability and preparedness. The social implications were significant. How you slept reflected your status and role in society. A jarl might sleep in fine wool and fur, but he still slept dressed and armed. A thrall might have only rough cloth, but the principle was the same. You stayed ready. Children learned early that bedtime didn't mean becoming defenseless. It meant transitioning from active readiness to passive alertness. The practical challenges were enormous. Sleeping in wool clothing meant dealing with itching, overheating, and the gradual accumulation of, let's call it, natural fragrance. Washing clothes was a major undertaking that couldn't be done frequently, so people learned to live with levels of personal hygiene that would horrify modern sensibilities. But again, comfort was secondary to survival. Leather items presented special problems. Leather boots, belts, and armor pieces couldn't be slept in comfortably, but they needed to be within arm's reach. Archaeological finds show evidence of specialized sleeping arrangements, where leather gear was positioned for quick access. Boots placed beside beds, belts hung on nearby pegs, leather armor arranged for rapid donning. The bedroom wasn't just for rest, it was a staging area for potential combat. Women's sleeping arrangements followed similar principles, but with different priorities. They might sleep in their daily dresses, but with modifications for comfort and nursing infants. Brooches and pins were repositioned or removed to prevent injury during sleep. Heavy outer garments might be loosened but not removed. The goal was maintaining warmth and modesty while being ready for nighttime duties like tending children or animals. The seasonal variations were dramatic. Summer nights in Scandinavia could be relatively mild, allowing for some loosening of garments. But winter sleeping required full Arctic gear, fur-lined cloaks, wool leggings, thick mittens that could be quickly removed if weapons were needed. Some warriors reportedly slept with their hands free but everything else bundled up, a compromise between warmth and combat readiness. The psychological impact can't be ignored. Never fully relaxing, never being completely vulnerable, created a constant state of alertness that probably contributed to the Vikings' reputation for toughness. Modern sleep researchers would probably diagnose this as chronic hypervigilance, but for Vikings, it was simply the price of staying alive. You didn't sleep deeply, because deep sleep was dangerous. Fire management while sleeping clothed was another challenge. Wool was relatively fire-resistant, but loose clothing near open flames was always risky. Sleeping arrangements had to account for both warmth and safety, with people positioned close enough to the fire for heat, but far enough away to avoid accidental ignition. The number of burn scars found on Viking remains suggests this balance wasn't always successful. If there's one rule that Viking culture seemed to follow religiously, it was this: never be more than arm's length from a blade, even when sleeping, especially when sleeping. For Vikings, the bed wasn't just a place to rest, it was a potential battlefield. The idea of tucking yourself in without a weapon nearby would have sounded as absurd to them as forgetting to bring your sword to a duel. So whether they were in a longhouse, on a boat, or camping under the stars, weapons were treated like bedtime companions, cold, pointy, and comforting. Sagas and archaeological evidence suggest that many Viking men, and some women, literally slept with their weapons. This didn't necessarily mean cuddling a sword like a teddy bear, though to be fair, some of them probably did. More often, weapons were placed under furs, beside bedrolls, or even held in hand. Think of it as security through sharp steel. And this wasn't about bravado, it was practical. Viking homes were often remote, vulnerable, and made of flammable wood. Bandits, rival clans, and wild animals didn't wait for daylight to strike. Being unarmed when startled awake was a quick way to become an epic poem no one remembered the end of. There's even a word for this mindset in Old Norse culture: vigilance. To sleep too deeply was to sleep carelessly. The truly honorable warrior stayed alert even in dreams. If you slept through a break-in, or worse, died in your sleep unarmed, good luck getting into Valhalla. Odin was picky, and he preferred warriors who died with weapons in hand, not drooling on their pillows. And the weapons themselves? They weren't stashed away in chests or racks. Axes leaned against walls, swords lay beside pillows, spears might be wedged under the bed frame if you were fancy enough to have one. A well-rested Viking was one who could go from snoring to swinging in under 5 seconds. Of course, this came with risks: the occasional midnight foot impalement, a few accidental elbow slices, but to a Viking, that was better than waking up defenseless. The archaeological record is fascinating here. Weapon graves, those burial sites where warriors were interred with their arms, show wear patterns that suggest these weren't ceremonial pieces. These were working weapons, used daily and slept with nightly. The handles show the kind of smooth wear that comes from constant handling, including the specific grip patterns that develop from being held during sleep. Different weapons required different sleeping arrangements. A seax, that long knife every Viking carried, could be tucked under a pillow or worn on a belt, even while lying down. Swords were longer and more awkward, usually placed alongside the body or propped against the wall within easy reach. Axes, being top-heavy, needed special consideration. You couldn't just lean them anywhere, or they'd fall over and potentially injure someone. Historians still argue whether weapons sleeping was universal or limited to warriors in dangerous times. Some evidence suggests that farmers and craftsmen might have relaxed this practice during peaceful periods, but the general principle remained. You kept something sharp nearby, even if it was just a work knife or woodcutting axe. The line between tool and weapon was blurrier in Viking culture than it is today. The logistics were complicated. In a longhouse where multiple families slept together, having everyone armed created obvious risks. Accidental injuries, arguments escalating quickly, the potential for tragedy when someone grabbed the wrong end of something in the dark. But apparently, these risks were considered acceptable compared to the alternative of being defenseless. Women's weapon sleeping followed different patterns. They might keep a small knife or dagger nearby, but the emphasis was often on defensive rather than offensive capability. Archaeological finds include women's graves with small blades positioned near the hands, suggesting they too slept armed, though perhaps more discreetly than their male counterparts. The seasonal aspects were significant. Winter sleeping with weapons was particularly challenging. Metal blades became painfully cold, and thick clothing made quick access more difficult. Some warriors reportedly warmed their weapon handles by the fire before bed, or wrapped them in cloth to prevent frostbite when grabbing them during emergencies. The dedication to maintaining armed readiness, even in brutal conditions, shows just how seriously Vikings took this practice. Children learned weapon sleeping early. Obviously, they didn't get full-size swords, but even young Vikings might sleep with practice weapons, wooden swords, or small knives. It was part of their education in survival and cultural identity. By the time they reached adulthood, sleeping armed felt as natural as sleeping clothed. The psychological impact was profound. Modern sleep studies show that sleeping with perceived threats nearby actually reduces sleep quality and increases stress hormones. But for Vikings, the stress of sleeping unarmed probably outweighed the stress of sleeping with weapons. It was a cultural adaptation to constant danger, and it worked until it didn't. Ship sleeping with weapons created unique challenges. On a crowded longship, space was at a premium, and weapons had to be secured against the ship's motion while remaining accessible. Some vessels had special weapon racks or hooks designed for this purpose. The risk of weapons becoming projectiles during rough seas had to be balanced against the need for quick access during attacks. Let's get one thing out of the way. The average Viking didn't fall asleep in some romantic fur-draped four-poster bed carved from ancient oak. That's Hollywood. The real story? Unless you were wealthy, noble, or at least high-ranking, your bed was likely a glorified sack of hay, possibly shared, definitely itchy. For the elite, yes, proper beds existed. Archaeological digs have found bed frames in high-status graves, complete with ornate carvings and decorative hardware. These were the wooden box beds often seen in museums and fantasy shows, partially enclosed for warmth, sometimes even with curtains to hold in heat and hold out snoring servants. But for most Vikings, not quite. Common folk slept on the floor, on benches, or on large wooden platforms near the hearth. Softness was relative. A pile of straw, moss, or wool-stuffed sacks if you were lucky, and some old boat sails or sheepskins if you weren't. Comfort was not the priority. Warmth and survival were. And don't picture a bedroom. The longhouse was one giant shared space. Kitchen, bedroom, stable, and panic room all in one. At best, beds were built into the walls. Wooden ledges where you could lie down, roll up in a fur, and try to ignore your cousin's breath. The closer to the central fire, the better. The elders and sick were often placed near it. Children and animals might be packed in around them, creating a sort of human-to-livestock heat sandwich. Romantic? No. Efficient? Very. Cleanliness was another issue. You didn't flip your mattress every 6 months. You shook out the straw when it started to smell like goat pee and hoped your fleas stayed on their half of the bed. And still, this was better than sleeping outdoors or on a ship deck with the wind howling down your tunic. Vikings weren't chasing REM cycles, they were chasing enough warmth to survive the night without waking up with frost on their eyebrows. The construction of these sleeping areas was ingenious within its limitations. Wooden platforms were raised slightly off the ground to provide insulation from the cold earth below. The wood itself was often specially treated with oils or resins to prevent rot and insect infestation. Archaeological evidence shows that these platforms were frequently rebuilt or reinforced, suggesting they saw heavy use and regular maintenance. Historians still argue whether the famous box beds were primarily for privacy, warmth, or status display. The partially enclosed design certainly helped retain body heat, but it also created a sense of personal space in the communal chaos of the longhouse. The more elaborate versions included small shelves for personal items and hooks for clothing, making them multi-purpose furniture pieces. The bedding materials varied dramatically by season and availability. Summer might bring fresh grass or leaves, which were relatively comfortable, but had to be changed frequently to prevent mold and insects. Winter bedding was more permanent, layers of wool, fur, and whatever fabric could be spared. The smell was probably horrific by modern standards, but it was warm, and that was what mattered. Social hierarchies were reflected in sleeping arrangements. The head of the household got the best spot, closest to the fire, on the most comfortable surface, with the warmest coverings. Family members were arranged in order of importance, with servants, slaves, and visitors getting progressively worse accommodations. Children often slept wherever they could find space, sometimes curled up with the family dog for warmth. The shared sleeping spaces created interesting social dynamics. Privacy was essentially non-existent, which meant that personal relationships, family disputes, and intimate moments all happened within earshot of everyone else. This probably contributed to the Vikings' reputation for being direct and uninhibited. When you can't hide anything, you learn to be honest about it. Maintenance of sleeping areas was a constant challenge. Straw and moss had to be replaced regularly, wool needed to be aired out and cleaned, and wooden surfaces required ongoing care to prevent splinters and rot. This wasn't just housekeeping, it was health and safety. A poorly maintained sleeping area could lead to illness, injury, or infestation that could affect the entire household. The transition from communal to private sleeping spaces happened gradually as Viking society became more settled and prosperous. Early longhouses were truly communal, with everyone sleeping in the same large room. Later structures began to include separate sleeping alcoves or small rooms, though these were still shared by multiple family members. Seasonal variations were dramatic. Summer sleeping was relatively pleasant. Longer days meant less time in bed, milder temperatures reduced the need for heavy coverings, and fresh air could circulate more freely. Winter was survival mode. Everyone packed together for warmth, windows sealed tight, and the constant struggle to balance ventilation with heat retention. The psychological impact of these sleeping arrangements shaped Viking culture in profound ways. Growing up without privacy, learning to sleep through chaos, developing tolerance for discomfort, these experiences created people who were remarkably adaptable and resilient. Modern comfort would probably have seemed as foreign to them as their sleeping arrangements seem to us. If you were a Viking of modest means, meaning you didn't own land, livestock, or a suspiciously shiny axe, then odds are you spent a good chunk of your life sleeping on dirt. Not metaphorically, literally. No mattress, no frame, just you, some animal skins, and a nice patch of packed earth that hopefully wasn't damp or covered in goat droppings. Inside longhouses, the floor was usually made of compacted dirt, sometimes sprinkled with straw to soften things up, or more realistically, to soak up whatever spilled from animals, soup bowls, or both. Sleeping directly on the floor wasn't a sign of failure. It was normal, functional, low-maintenance Viking minimalism at its finest. And for the truly poor, this might have been their only option. No benches, no wooden slats, just fur pelts laid down in a spot with good fire access and minimal hoof traffic. There are even accounts of travelers and guests sleeping near the doorway, which in Viking terms was one rung above, outside, on the hospitality ladder. Sleeping by the door meant you were welcome, just not that welcome. Also, you were probably the first person to get stabbed if someone broke in, so that was fun. The advantage of sleeping on dirt was heat. Earth retains warmth surprisingly well, especially if you're pressed between two other humans and a dog. And when your biggest enemy is freezing to death, you take what you can get. In the summer, it stayed cool, though comfortable is probably a strong word. Survivable might be more accurate. Archaeological evidence reveals fascinating details about these dirt floors. They weren't just random patches of ground. They were carefully prepared surfaces, often mixed with clay and organic materials to create a harder, more durable foundation. Some floors show evidence of being treated with oils or other substances to reduce dust and improve hygiene. The layers of accumulated debris tell stories of daily life: food scraps, wood shavings, and yes, quite a bit of organic waste. Of course, this style of sleep didn't come with back support. There were no chiropractors in the Viking Age. If you hurt your spine, you walked it off or became a bard. Still, for all its discomfort, this wasn't seen as shameful or sad. In Viking culture, toughness was admired, and luxury was sometimes viewed with suspicion. If you could sleep on the ground and wake up ready to raid a monastery, you were doing just fine. The social implications were complex. Sleeping on dirt wasn't necessarily about poverty. It was often about practicality and cultural values. Even wealthy Vikings might choose floor sleeping during travels or military campaigns. It was seen as a sign of strength and adaptability. The ability to sleep anywhere, under any conditions, was a survival skill that could mean the difference between life and death. Historians still argue whether floor sleeping was primarily driven by necessity or cultural preference. Some evidence suggests that even when better options were available, Vikings sometimes chose the floor for its perceived benefits. The firmness might have been better for certain back problems, and the direct contact with the earth had spiritual significance in Norse beliefs about connection to the natural world. The seasonal challenges were immense. Summer dirt floors could become dusty and uncomfortable, requiring frequent sweeping and maintenance. Winter floors were cold and hard, demanding extra layers of insulation. Spring brought the nightmare of mud and moisture seeping through walls and creating soggy sleeping surfaces. Fall meant preparing for months of harsh conditions ahead. Family arrangements on dirt floors required careful planning. Parents might create small elevated areas for children using extra furs or straw, while adults took the harder surfaces. The elderly often got priority for any available cushioning, both as a sign of respect and practical necessity. Pregnant women received special consideration, with softer materials arranged to support their changing bodies. The hygiene aspects were challenging. Dirt floors absorbed spills, odors, and worse. Regular cleaning involved scraping away the top layer of soil and replacing it with fresh earth. Some households developed sophisticated systems for managing waste and maintaining cleanliness, including drainage channels and strategic placement of absorbent materials. Privacy on dirt floors was virtually non-existent. Without raised surfaces or enclosed spaces, everyone was essentially sleeping on the same level. This created unique social dynamics where personal space was defined by unspoken rules and careful positioning. Families developed complex etiquette around movement, noise, and personal boundaries. The psychological adaptation required was significant. Modern sleep researchers have found that sleeping on hard surfaces can actually improve certain aspects of sleep quality, though the adjustment period is difficult. Vikings who grew up sleeping on dirt probably developed physical and mental adaptations that made them more resilient to discomfort than their modern counterparts. The transition to better sleeping arrangements was gradual and often temporary. A successful raid might bring enough wealth to afford proper bedding, but economic downturns could force families back to dirt floors. This created a flexible attitude toward comfort that valued adaptability over consistency. If you value silence, personal space, and separate bedrooms, you may want to skip time traveling to the Viking Age, because for most Norse folk, sleeping was a communal sport. Entire families, and sometimes extended families, house servants, visitors, and the occasional animal, all slept in the same room, and often in the same bed platform, not for fun, for warmth. Remember, This was medieval Scandinavia. Winters were long, cold, and unforgiving, and fireplaces weren't exactly cranking out modern insulation. So unless you were nobility with your own private box bed, and even then it wasn't that private, you shared whatever sleeping space was available. The closer to the fire, the better. The closer to grandma's snoring mouth, less ideal. Longhouses were the Viking version of open-plan living. No interior walls, no cozy nooks, just a central hearth with people arranged like tired sardines on either side. Beds, if you had one, were built into the walls or arranged along benches. Otherwise, you picked a spot on the floor and made it work. If someone rolled into your space during the night, congratulations, you were now friends. Sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they reflected status. The heads of the household usually got the warmest, most central positions. Children were packed in wherever they'd fit. Servants and distant cousins got the outer edges, possibly next to the door, the dog, or the family goat. If you woke up with a hoof in your face, well, try not to take it personally. And let's not forget, all of this was happening with zero ventilation. A packed room full of humans, animals, smoke, stew, and the faint musk of wool and wet boots. You didn't sleep through the night, you survived it. Privacy? That was a Roman problem. Vikings didn't need it. In fact, some scholars suggest that this close proximity, sleeping, encouraged strong social bonds, the kind forged through firelight, shared stories, and the mutual trauma of hearing your uncle mumble Viking poetry in his sleep. The logistics of communal sleeping were staggering. A typical longhouse might accommodate 20 to 30 people, all trying to find sleeping space within range of the fire's warmth. The arrangements required careful negotiation and established protocols. Who slept where wasn't random. It was determined by age, gender, family relationships, and social status. Breaking these unspoken rules could create conflicts that lasted for generations. Archaeological evidence shows that longhouses were designed with communal sleeping in mind. Raised platforms ran along the sides of the main hall, creating designated sleeping areas that could accommodate multiple families. The width and spacing of these platforms suggests they were meant for shared use, not individual privacy. Even the ceiling height was calculated to retain heat while allowing for air circulation among the sleeping masses. The social dynamics were incredibly complex. Imagine trying to maintain family relationships, romantic partnerships, and personal dignity while sleeping inches away from your in-laws, children, and possibly your boss. Vikings developed elaborate etiquette around nighttime behavior. When to speak, when to be quiet, how to move without disturbing others, and how to handle bodily functions discreetly. Historians still argue whether communal sleeping was purely practical or served deeper social functions. Some evidence suggests it was a bonding mechanism that strengthened clan loyalty and family unity. Others point to the health benefits of shared body heat and the security advantages of never sleeping alone. The constant proximity probably contributed to the Vikings' reputation for being direct and uninhibited in their social interactions. The challenges for couples were particularly interesting. Romantic relationships and intimate moments had to be carefully managed in spaces shared with children, parents, and extended family. Some longhouses had small alcoves or temporary partitions for privacy, but these were luxuries that not everyone could afford. Most couples learned to be creative with timing and location, finding moments of privacy during the day or using the midnight interval between sleep periods. Child rearing in communal sleeping arrangements created unique family dynamics. Children learned early that they were part of a larger social unit, not just a nuclear family. They absorbed lessons about cooperation, sharing, and social hierarchy simply by observing nighttime behavior. The constant presence of adults also meant that children received attention and supervision from multiple sources, creating a community-based approach to child care. The seasonal variations were dramatic. Summer nights might allow for some spreading out, with people sleeping outdoors or in temporary shelters. Winter forced everyone closer together, creating maximum density and minimum comfort. Spring and fall brought their own challenges, as sleeping arrangements shifted to accommodate changing weather and agricultural demands. The health implications were significant. Communicable diseases spread rapidly in close quarters, and personal hygiene became a community concern. But the shared body heat also provided survival advantages that probably outweighed the health risks. Modern studies of communal sleeping in cold climates show that it can be surprisingly effective at maintaining core body temperature and preventing hypothermia. The noise levels must have been incredible. Snoring, talking, coughing, children crying, animals moving around. Sleeping through all of this required either exceptional tolerance or complete exhaustion. Vikings probably developed the ability to sleep through chaos out of sheer necessity, a skill that served them well during military campaigns and sea voyages. If you thought sharing a sleeping platform with your in-laws was rough, imagine throwing a goat into the mix, or a cow, or 3 chickens who absolutely refused to shut up. Welcome to the Viking version of central heating, sleeping with your livestock. No, this wasn't some quirky rural tradition. This was survival. Viking longhouses were multi-purpose structures. One big room for eating, sleeping, working, storytelling, and yes, sheltering animals. In fact, many longhouses were split into 2 main areas, one for humans, one for livestock. Sometimes there was a raised threshold between them, sometimes there was a wooden partition, and sometimes you just accepted that the family sheep was now your bedtime neighbor. Why? Because animals gave off heat, and in Scandinavian winters, every bit counted. A cow could warm up a small corner of a house just by existing. Several cows? That was practically radiant floor heating. Chickens were less effective, more chaotic, but still helpful. And the animals weren't exactly free roaming through the house. They had stalls or pens, at least in well-built homes. But sounds, smells, and the occasional escape attempt were part of the nightly soundtrack. A gentle lullaby of hoof scraping, snorting, clucking, and maybe the sound of a pig loudly judging your dreams. Cleanliness, as you can guess, was not optimal. Floors were packed earth, straw was everywhere, and the line between kitchen and barn was more of a vague suggestion. But for Viking families, the trade-off was worth it. Stay warm and alive, or stay clean and dead? Easy choice. The archaeological record provides fascinating insights into these arrangements. Longhouse excavations reveal sophisticated drainage systems designed to manage animal waste, specialized feeding areas positioned to minimize mess in human spaces, and even evidence of different flooring materials used to separate living areas from animal quarters. The Vikings weren't just throwing animals and humans together randomly, they were engineering solutions to make it work. Sleeping with animals wasn't considered strange, it was a sign that you were doing things right. You were maximizing resources, protecting your animals from theft or cold, and ensuring your children didn't turn into Viking popsicles overnight. And of course, kids loved it. Free heat and a living pillow, what more could you want? The types of animals varied by region and wealth. Cattle were the premium choice, large, warm, and relatively calm at night. Goats were more common but also more mischievous, with a tendency to eat anything they could reach, including bedding and clothing. Sheep were docile, but produced less heat. Pigs were warm, but noisy and smelly. Chickens provided minimal heat, but were valuable for eggs and meat. The seasonal dynamics were complex. Summer nights might allow animals to sleep outdoors or in separate shelters, giving humans more space and better air quality. Winter forced everyone indoors, creating maximum density and minimum comfort. Spring brought the chaos of newborn animals, which required extra care and supervision. Fall meant preparing for months of close quarters ahead. Historians still argue whether animal co-sleeping was universal or limited to poorer families. Some evidence suggests that wealthy Vikings might have had separate animal shelters, but even they probably brought valuable animals indoors during extreme weather. The practice seems to have been more about practicality than poverty, though certainly the poor had fewer options. The health implications were significant. Living with animals increased exposure to parasites, diseases, and allergens. But it also provided crucial warmth that probably prevented more deaths than it caused. Modern studies of traditional societies show that animal co-sleeping can be surprisingly effective at maintaining human body temperature in cold climates. The social aspects were fascinating. Children grew up with intimate knowledge of animal behavior, agricultural cycles, and the realities of food production. They learned responsibility by caring for animals, and they developed a practical understanding of life and death that modern urban children rarely experience. The animals weren't pets, they were partners in survival. The practical challenges were enormous: managing animal waste, preventing property damage, maintaining hygiene, and dealing with sick or injured animals all became household responsibilities. Families developed sophisticated systems for feeding, watering, and caring for their livestock while minimizing disruption to human activities. The noise factor was probably the biggest challenge. Animals don't sleep on human schedules, and they certainly don't respect human needs for quiet rest. Roosters crowing before dawn, cows lowing for food, goats bleating for attention. Sleeping through this cacophony required either extraordinary tolerance or complete exhaustion. The smell was another constant companion. Even with good ventilation and regular cleaning, the combination of animal waste, wet straw, and confined spaces created aromatic conditions that would challenge modern sensibilities. Vikings probably developed olfactory tolerance out of necessity, though visitors from other regions often commented on the distinctive fragrance of Norse households. The emotional bonds between humans and animals were complex. These weren't pets in the modern sense, but they weren't just livestock either. They were survival partners, sources of warmth, food, and companionship. The death of a valuable animal was both an economic disaster and an emotional loss, affecting the entire family's prospects for surviving the winter. Let's say you were a Viking on the move, heading out for a quick raid, a long trade expedition, or maybe a casual colonization attempt. That meant one thing: you were sleeping on a boat. And Viking ships weren't exactly luxury liners. Viking longships were sleek, open-decked vessels powered by sails and rowers, designed for speed and terrifying surprise appearances on foreign shores. But comfort? Not in the budget. There were no cabins, no hammocks, no cozy little berths, just planks, cold, wet planks, and maybe a pile of sails if someone let you borrow one. Sleep aboard ship was entirely dictated by weather, waves, and watch duty. There was no schedule, just exhaustion. Row for hours, sleep when you can. Sometimes you'd collapse in your own sweat and sea spray. Other times you'd try to catch a nap while lying next to barrels of dried fish and a guy with a leaky helmet. If it rained, you got wet. If the wind picked up, you braced yourself and tried not to slide into someone's sword. And if you were lucky enough to sleep beneath the sail, congratulations, you just earned the VIP section. Crew members often rotated shifts. Some would steer, some would row, and some would try to get a few moments of rest in the midst of groaning wood and crashing waves. It wasn't restful, it wasn't quiet, it was barely sleep, more like extended blinking. And then there were the smells. Salt water, unwashed bodies, dried meat, and sheep, if you brought livestock along. Imagine trying to drift off while someone sharpens a blade behind you and a goat stands over your face. That's not a nightmare. That's Tuesday on a Viking ship. The physical challenges were immense. Longships were designed for speed and maneuverability, not comfort. The hull was shallow and narrow, leaving minimal space for human bodies. 30 to 40 warriors had to find sleeping space on a vessel that was essentially a floating plank. The solution was creative positioning. Some slept along the sides, others found spots between rowing benches, and a few lucky individuals might claim space near the mast. Archaeological evidence from ship burials reveals the reality of these sleeping arrangements. The famous Gokstad ship, excavated in Norway, shows wear patterns on the decking that suggest regular use as sleeping surfaces. The spacing between the rowing benches was just wide enough for a human body, creating natural sleeping compartments for the crew. But the Vikings weren't looking for comfort. They were looking for conquest. Sleep on a ship wasn't about rest. It was about survival between storms. You didn't need to feel refreshed. You just needed to be able to swing an axe when you reached land. The psychological adaptation required was significant. Modern people struggle to sleep on planes or trains, but Vikings learned to rest while being constantly soaked, buffeted by waves, and surrounded by armed strangers. The weather was the ultimate determining factor. Calm seas might allow for relatively peaceful rest, though the constant motion still made deep sleep difficult. Rough weather meant clinging to whatever you could grab and hoping you didn't get washed overboard. Storm conditions required everyone to be awake and actively working to keep the ship afloat. Historians still argue whether Vikings developed special techniques for ship sleeping or simply endured through toughness and necessity. Some evidence suggests they used rope systems to secure themselves to the ship, preventing injury during rough seas. Others point to specialized sleeping positions that provided stability while maintaining readiness for emergency action. The social dynamics were fascinating. Ship crews developed hierarchies that determined sleeping arrangements. The ship's captain might have a slightly better spot near the steering oar, while ordinary crew members made do with whatever space they could find. Experienced sailors learned to claim the best positions quickly, while newcomers often ended up in the worst spots until they proved themselves. The seasonal variations were dramatic. Summer voyages in calm weather might actually be pleasant, with mild temperatures and gentle swells. Winter sailing was survival mode, cold, wet, and dangerous, with limited daylight and constant threat of storms. Spring and fall brought unpredictable weather that could change from calm to deadly in minutes. The equipment for ship sleeping was minimal but crucial. Waterproof cloaks and covers, though waterproof was relative in Viking times. Thick wool blankets that retained some warmth even when wet. Personal items that could be secured against the ship's motion. Everything had to be portable, durable, and expendable. The health implications were severe. Constant exposure to salt water, limited fresh water for drinking and washing, poor nutrition from preserved foods, and the stress of potential combat all took their toll. Viking sailors probably suffered from various skin conditions, respiratory problems, and other health issues that modern maritime workers would find intolerable. The noise levels were constant and unpredictable. Creaking wood, slapping waves, wind in the rigging, and the sounds of 30 men trying to sleep in close quarters. Add the occasional animal noise if livestock was aboard, and you had an acoustic environment that would challenge even the most exhausted warrior. For the Vikings, dreams weren't just a side effect of sleep, they were messages. Whispers from the gods, warnings from the dead, and occasionally psychic spoilers for how your week was about to go. Viking sagas and Eddic poetry are full of dream omens. A ship sailing west in a dream, you're gonna die soon. Dream of a cold wind blowing through your house, also death. Wolves running through the village in your sleep, definitely death. Basically, if you woke up and remembered anything, it probably meant you should update your will and maybe not go on that raid tomorrow. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some dreams were seen as visions from Odin or Freya, offering insight into battles, harvests, or hidden treasure. A good dream could elevate your status. A bad one? Well, if you were smart, you kept it to yourself. No one wanted to be that guy on the boat who announced he saw everyone drowning in his sleep. Very poor morale. The Vikings even had dream interpreters, people who were considered spiritually attuned and could decipher what your nighttime visions meant. They weren't therapists. They didn't care if you were stressed about goat taxes. They wanted symbols: ravens, fire, ice, broken swords, three-headed oxen. The weirder the better. And dreaming about the gods? That was serious business. Dreaming of Odin in particular could mean anything from divine favor to imminent slaughter. If he appeared in your dream offering advice, that was great. If he appeared silent, wearing a cloak and walking away, start digging your grave. He was known for being mysterious even in REM sleep. The cultural framework around dreams was sophisticated and deeply integrated into daily life. Vikings didn't dismiss dreams as random neural activity. They treated them as intelligence reports from the spiritual realm. Archaeological evidence includes dream recording devices, rune stones, and wooden tablets, where important dreams were carved for future reference and interpretation. There was also a belief in dreamwalking, the idea that your spirit could leave your body during sleep and travel elsewhere. This meant a lot of people took sleep very seriously. You weren't just snoring, you were possibly off fighting spiritual battles in other realms while your body drooled on a sheepskin. Historians still argue whether dreamwalking was considered literal travel or metaphorical experience, but the Vikings clearly believed consciousness could operate independently of the physical body. The types of dreams had specific meanings. Prophetic dreams showed future events, usually disasters or battles. Visitation dreams brought messages from dead relatives or gods. Warning dreams highlighted dangers or bad decisions. Healing dreams provided medical advice or spiritual cleansing. Each category required different interpretation methods and responses. The timing of dreams was crucial. Dreams during the first sleep were considered more reliable than those during second sleep. Dawn dreams, occurring just before waking, were thought to be the most powerful and immediate. The phase of the moon, the season, and even the dreamer's recent actions all influenced the dream's significance and reliability. Professional dream interpreters, often women with connections to the vulva tradition, used complex systems of symbol analysis. A dream about water might mean emotional change, spiritual cleansing, or literal flooding, depending on the context. Animals in dreams represented different aspects of the dreamer's personality or external forces. The color, size, and behavior of dream elements all contributed to the interpretation. The social implications were significant. A chieftain's dreams might influence military decisions, trade negotiations, or settlement patterns. A mother's dreams could affect family planning, marriage arrangements, or child-rearing practices. Dreams weren't private experiences. They were community resources that required sharing and discussion. The seasonal aspects were important too. Winter dreams were considered more powerful because the long nights provided extended opportunities for spiritual communication. Summer dreams were less reliable because the shortened darkness limited the god's ability to send clear messages. Spring dreams often related to agricultural decisions, while autumn dreams focused on preparation for winter hardships. The religious integration was complete. Dreams were part of the broader Norse spiritual system that included prayer, sacrifice, and divination. They weren't separate from religious practice, they were religious practice. The ability to receive and interpret dreams was considered a spiritual gift that required cultivation and respect. The psychological functions were probably significant too. In a culture with limited understanding of mental health, dreams provided a framework for processing trauma, anxiety, and emotional stress. The belief that dreams came from external sources might have helped people cope with difficult experiences by externalizing their psychological struggles. The practical applications were endless. Dreams guided military strategy, agricultural planning, trade decisions, and personal relationships. A well-timed dream could change the course of a battle, the success of a harvest, or the fate of a marriage. The Vikings weren't just sleeping. They were gathering intelligence from the spiritual realm. Most people prepare for sleep by brushing their teeth, changing clothes, and maybe reading a book. Vikings, they sometimes prepared for sleep by putting on armor, just in case it was their last nap before meeting Odin. This wasn't paranoia, it was ritual preparation for battle. On the night before a fight, a raid, or any journey that might end in bloodshed, a Viking warrior might lay down in full gear. Chainmail, helmet beside the bed, sword at the ready. Not because it was comfortable, it definitely wasn't, but because they believed the gods respected readiness. To die well, and to die ready, increased your chances of being chosen by the Valkyries. Sleeping unarmed? That was like showing up to Valhalla in your underpants. Some warriors believed that how you slept the night before battle could determine where your soul ended up. If you were prepared, alert, and mentally already in fight mode, Odin would notice. If you were cozy, drooling on your tunic, and forgot your axe in the other room, well, you might just wake up in hell, the icy afterlife reserved for people who died unheroically. A terrible fate for someone who owned 12 axes and bragged about it. The practice wasn't universal, of course. Not everyone had armor. It was expensive. But even simpler folk sometimes slept in their travel gear or with their weapons in hand the night before a dangerous trip. It was a symbolic statement to the gods and to your crew. I'm ready. Let's go. And it wasn't just about death. Sleeping this way also had tactical advantages. If you were ambushed, you didn't have time for a costume change. A fully geared warrior could leap up and fight within seconds. Imagine being the enemy who sneaks into a Viking camp only to find your target already half awake and fully armed. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical readiness. Sleeping in armor was a commitment to the warrior mindset. It was a way of telling yourself and your gods that you had already accepted the possibility of death and were prepared to face it with honor. Modern military psychology recognizes similar rituals that help soldiers transition from civilian to combat mentality. The practical challenges were immense. Chainmail was heavy, cold, and uncomfortable. Sleeping in it required special techniques to prevent injury and maintain circulation. Warriors learned to position themselves carefully to avoid pressure points and distribute weight evenly. Some used extra padding or special sleeping surfaces to make armored sleep more tolerable. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or limited to elite warriors and special occasions. The archaeological evidence is mixed. Some warrior graves show wear patterns on armor that suggest regular sleeping, while others appear to have been used only for combat and ceremonies. The truth probably varied by region, time period, and individual circumstances. The seasonal considerations were significant. Summer armor sleeping was challenging because of heat and discomfort. Winter added the problems of cold metal and reduced dexterity. Spring and fall brought unpredictable weather that could make armored sleep dangerous if conditions changed rapidly during the night. The social aspects were complex. Sleeping in armor was a sign of dedication and preparedness, but it also created practical problems in shared sleeping spaces. The noise of metal on metal, the space requirements, and the potential for accidentally injuring sleeping partners all had to be managed carefully. The spiritual dimensions were profound. Vikings believed that the transition from sleep to battle was a sacred process that required proper preparation. The armor wasn't just protection, it was a ritual garment that connected the warrior to the divine forces that governed combat and death. Putting on armor was like putting on a sacred identity. The maintenance requirements were significant. Armor that was slept in regularly required constant care to prevent rust, damage, and wear. Oil treatments, cleaning, and repair became part of the pre-battle routine. A warrior who neglected his armor was neglecting his spiritual preparation as well as his physical protection. The psychological effects were probably both positive and negative. Sleeping in armor might have increased confidence and readiness, but it also created constant reminders of mortality and danger. The inability to fully relax probably contributed to the hypervigilance that characterized Viking warrior culture. The tactical benefits were real. Warriors who slept ready could respond to threats faster and more effectively. In an era when surprise attacks were common, the ability to go from sleep to combat in seconds could mean the difference between life and death for an entire warband. The cultural symbolism was powerful. Armor sleeping represented the ultimate commitment to the warrior path. It was a public declaration that the individual had chosen death before dishonor and was prepared to face the consequences. This wasn't just about individual preparation, it was about cultural identity and social expectations. When winter hit Scandinavia, it didn't arrive, it conquered. Snow fell like punishment, the sun went into hiding, and the temperature dipped too. Why is my beard frozen to my chest? During these dark months, Viking activity slowed and sleep increased. Yes, the Vikings may have been early practitioners of a kind of human hibernation, not the biological kind that bears do, but a seasonal rhythm of extended rest and reduced activity. In short, they slept a lot more in winter, and who could blame them? With limited daylight, icy travel conditions, and little farming to do, there wasn't much incentive to leap out of bed at sunrise, especially when the sunrise wasn't until 10:30 a.m. Winter became a time of conservation. Conserve energy, conserve food, and try not to freeze solid by February. Sleeping longer during winter wasn't just a comfort, it was strategic. Less movement meant less food burned, and food supplies were precious. Why burn calories chopping wood when you could just add more layers and sleep through the next blizzard? Many families stayed indoors for days at a time, crowded around the hearth, sharing stories, mead, and heat. It wasn't laziness, it was adaptation. Extended rest also allowed bodies to recover from months of labor, hunting, and war. Think of it as ancient off-season training, if that training involved a lot of snoring and reindeer fur. Sagas and folktales from the far north even hint at dream seasons, periods when people felt slow, reflective, even spiritually distant from daily life. It's possible that the Norse viewed winter not just as downtime, but as a mystical season where sleep, dreams, and introspection blurred together. The physiological adaptations were remarkable. Modern sleep research shows that humans naturally sleep more during winter months when exposed to natural light cycles. The Vikings, living without artificial lighting, would have experienced this seasonal shift more dramatically than most cultures. Their bodies probably adjusted to longer sleep periods as a survival mechanism. Archaeological evidence supports this winter hibernation theory. Longhouse excavations show evidence of extended occupation during winter months, with wear patterns suggesting people spent significantly more time indoors. Food storage systems were designed to support populations that were largely inactive for months at a time. The social dynamics of winter sleeping were complex. Extended periods of communal living in cramped spaces created unique challenges for family relationships and community harmony. Vikings developed elaborate social protocols for managing conflicts, boredom, and cabin fever during the long, dark months. Historians still argue whether this seasonal sleep pattern was universal or varied by region and social class. Northern communities probably experienced more extreme seasonal variations than southern settlements. Wealthy families with better food supplies might have maintained more normal activity levels, while poorer families relied more heavily on energy conservation. The cultural activities during winter were specifically designed around extended rest periods. Storytelling, crafts, and indoor games provided entertainment that didn't require much physical energy. These activities often took place in comfortable positions that allowed for dozing and semi-sleep states. The psychological benefits were probably significant. Extended winter rest might have provided mental health benefits in a culture that experienced high levels of stress and trauma. The forced inactivity gave people time to process experiences, maintain social bonds, and prepare mentally for the challenges of spring and summer. The nutritional aspects were crucial. Winter food supplies were limited and needed to last for months. Reducing activity levels through extended sleep helped stretch food resources and prevent malnutrition. The Vikings understood intuitively what modern science has confirmed about the relationship between activity levels and caloric needs. The spiritual dimensions were important too. Winter was considered a time of spiritual reflection and connection with the other world. The long nights provided extended opportunities for dream experiences, meditation, and communication with ancestors and gods. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was spiritual practice. The practical challenges were enormous. Maintaining hygiene during extended periods of inactivity, managing waste in confined spaces, and preventing disease in crowded conditions all required careful planning and community cooperation. Winter sleeping wasn't just about individual comfort. It was about community survival. The seasonal transition was gradual and carefully managed. The shift from active summer schedules to winter rest periods didn't happen overnight. Families prepared for months in advance, storing food, gathering fuel, and organizing living spaces for extended occupation. The return to spring activity was equally gradual, allowing bodies to readjust to higher activity levels. And while some people still needed to stay active, guarding animals, fetching firewood, preparing food, there was definitely a shift. Winter was not the time to launch a raid. It was the time to sleep, plan a raid, and recover from the last one. The seasonal rhythm of Viking life was deeply connected to the natural cycles of light, temperature, and food availability. While most Viking sleep habits were about staying warm, alive, and slightly less stabbed, there were moments when Vikings chose not to sleep at all. And not because of insomnia or goats being weird. Sometimes staying awake all night was intentional, even sacred. Enter ritual wakefulness. Certain Viking traditions and ceremonies involved deliberate sleep deprivation, usually to honor the dead, communicate with the gods, or prepare for something very big and very bloody. For example, during funerals, it was common for mourners to stay awake through the night in vigil, drinking, reciting poetry, and sharing stories of the deceased. Think of it as a cross between a wake and a Norse TED Talk, but with more ale and occasional axe juggling. These overnight gatherings weren't optional. Staying awake showed respect. Falling asleep? That was bad form, like texting during a eulogy, but with a higher risk of being elbowed awake by a drunk cousin. Vigils also had a spiritual edge. The Norse believed that the veil between worlds was thinner at night, especially when someone had just died. Staying awake meant you could feel the presence of the departed, maybe even catch a vision or two. Whether this was divine connection or too much fermented honey, we may never know. Warriors too practiced ritual wakefulness before a raid or major battle. A night without sleep could serve as a form of mental sharpening. A time to meditate, focus, or psych yourself up by staring into the fire and thinking about how awesome Valhalla sounds. Some warriors even claimed to receive omens or dreams while still awake, sitting trance-like before combat. And then there were seers and vulvas who sometimes stayed awake all night to perform rituals, chant spells, or interpret dreams others had. They were expected to remain alert, still, and disturbingly calm while everyone else was nodding off into their bowls of porridge. The funeral vigils were elaborate affairs that combined grief, celebration, and spiritual practice. Family members, friends, and community members would gather around the deceased, sharing memories, singing songs, and maintaining constant watch over the body. The belief was that the soul needed guidance during its transition to the afterlife, and sleeping mourners couldn't provide that guidance. Archaeological evidence includes specialized funeral sites with evidence of extended occupation during vigil periods. Ash layers from fires that burned all night, food remains from communal meals, and wear patterns suggesting large groups spending extended time in funeral locations. These weren't brief ceremonies. They were multi-day events that required serious commitment. The warrior preparation rituals were psychologically sophisticated. Modern military psychology recognizes the importance of pre-combat mental preparation, and the Vikings seem to have understood this intuitively. The all-night vigil served multiple purposes. It created a clear psychological transition from civilian to warrior mindset. It provided time for mental rehearsal and visualization, and it demonstrated commitment to the upcoming battle. Historians still argue whether these practices were universal or limited to special occasions and elite participants. The physical demands of staying awake all night were significant, and not everyone could participate fully. Pregnant women, children, and the elderly might have had modified roles that allowed for some rest while maintaining spiritual participation. The seasonal timing was important. Winter vigils were easier to maintain because of the long nights, but they were also more challenging because of the cold and limited food supplies. Summer vigils had to compete with the short nights and the demands of agricultural work. Spring and fall vigils often coincided with seasonal festivals and religious observances. The social functions were complex. Vigils served as community bonding experiences that strengthened clan relationships and cultural identity. They provided opportunities for older members to pass down oral traditions, for young people to demonstrate their commitment to cultural values, and for families to process grief and trauma collectively. The spiritual techniques were sophisticated. Participants used various methods to maintain alertness and spiritual openness. Rhythmic chanting, repetitive physical movements, controlled breathing, and meditation practices. These techniques were designed to alter consciousness and facilitate communication with the spiritual realm. The practical challenges were enormous. Maintaining fires all night, providing food and drink for large groups, managing waste and hygiene during extended gatherings, and ensuring security during vulnerable periods all required careful planning and community cooperation. The psychological effects were probably profound. Sleep deprivation can create altered states of consciousness that might have enhanced spiritual experiences. The combination of grief, exhaustion, and ritual practice could produce visions, insights, and emotional release that participants interpreted as divine communication. The cultural significance was deep. Ritual wakefulness represented the ultimate sacrifice of personal comfort for spiritual or community purposes. It demonstrated the individual's commitment to values that transcended physical needs and connected them to the larger cosmic order that governed Viking worldview. After all the sagas, ship raids, and stew-fueled storytelling, one truth about Viking sleep becomes clear. It wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. If modern people treat sleep like a wellness activity, the Vikings treated it like one more arena to stay alive in. Everything about their rest was hard-earned. They slept in shifts so nobody got ambushed. They curled up beside fire pits, animals, and relatives because insulation was more valuable than privacy. They wore their clothes and sometimes their armor into bed because you never knew who or what was coming through the door next. They saw dreams not as random brain static, but as potential prophecies. They accepted that sometimes sleep was meant to restore the body, and sometimes it was meant to prepare the soul for death. Even their rituals of wakefulness, staying up all night during funerals or battle vigils, reinforced the idea that sleep was not guaranteed and not something to be taken lightly. For the Norse, every moment of rest had a purpose. Sometimes that purpose was warmth, sometimes it was readiness, and sometimes it was to prove you were still stronger than the night itself. Comfort? That was for after the raid, after the snow melted, after you made it home with both legs? Maybe. Then you'd get a bed, probably still shared, possibly next to a goat. But despite all that, Viking sleep wasn't bleak. It was resilient. They adapted to their brutal environment with raw practicality and a touch of mysticism. They didn't invent bedtime stories, but they sure knew how to turn dreams into legends. And maybe that's the most Viking thing of all. They didn't romanticize sleep. They didn't overthink it. They just did what had to be done, wrapped in wool, holding an axe, snoring beneath a sagging roof while the wind howled and the world waited for spring. The legacy of Viking sleep habits extends far beyond their historical period. Modern sleep researchers have found that many Viking practices, segmented sleep, seasonal variations, communal sleeping for warmth, actually align with natural human circadian rhythms better than our current sleep patterns. We might have something to learn from these ancient warriors who treated sleep as a survival skill rather than a luxury. Historians still argue whether Viking sleep culture was primarily shaped by necessity or choice, but the evidence suggests it was both. They created sophisticated systems for managing rest in extreme conditions, developed cultural practices that supported community survival, and maintained spiritual beliefs that gave meaning to their nocturnal experiences. The archaeological record continues to reveal new details about Viking sleep habits. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of specialized sleeping areas, advanced heating systems, and even what might be the earliest known sleep aids. Herbal preparations found near sleeping areas that could have promoted rest or enhanced dream experiences. The psychological adaptations were remarkable. Vikings developed mental resilience that allowed them to function effectively with interrupted sleep, shared spaces, and constant vigilance. These skills served them well in their roles as warriors, explorers, and survivors in one of history's most challenging environments. The social innovations were equally impressive. They created systems for managing large groups in confined spaces, developed etiquette for communal living, and established protocols for maintaining security while allowing for rest. These weren't just practical solutions, they were cultural achievements that enabled their society to thrive in conditions that would defeat most modern communities. The spiritual dimensions were profound and lasting. The Viking understanding of sleep as a bridge between worlds, dreams as divine communication, and rest as spiritual practice influenced Scandinavian culture for centuries. Elements of these beliefs can still be found in modern Nordic folklore and cultural practices. As we drift toward our own rest tonight, perhaps we can appreciate what the Vikings understood instinctively. Sleep isn't separate from life. It's part of it. Every night is an adventure. Every dream a potential message. Every moment of rest a small victory against the forces that would keep us awake. They faced their darkness with courage, humor, and the kind of stubborn determination that kept them warm even when the world was cold. So tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed with your central heating and your memory foam mattress, remember those ancient warriors who found ways to rest with dignity, even when surrounded by goats, armed with axes, and dreaming of Valhalla. They remind us that humans can adapt to almost anything, and that sometimes the most profound rest comes not from perfect conditions, but from the simple act of closing your eyes and trusting that morning will come. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be as peaceful as theirs was purposeful.